Imagine facing winter, knowing that the food you put away in October had to last until April, with no refrigerator, no freezer, and no corner store to bail you out when supplies ran low. This was the reality for World War II families who faced both rationing and the lack of modern food preservation technology. While wealthier homes might have had ice boxes, most families relied on methods that had sustained people for centuries, techniques passed down through generations and perfected out of necessity. Let's explore 20 ways World War II families stocked up for winter without refrigeration. Methods that kept America fed through one of the most challenging periods in modern history. Canned everything in mason jars. The rhythmic sound of pressure, canners hissing on wood stoves, and the satisfying ping of ceiling lids marked late summer and fall in World War II homes. Families canned relentlessly, processing everything the garden produced into jars that would line cellar shelves like edible insurance. Tomatoes became sauce, whole canned tomatoes, and juice. Green beans were packed in brine. Peaches, pears, and cherries were preserved in sugar syrup when sugar rations allowed. But World War II families went further than modern canners typically do. They canned meats, soups, stews, and even complete meals, creating shelf-stable food that required only reheating. Pressure canners, which could reach the temperatures necessary to process low-acid foods like meat and vegetables safely, became essential equipment. A properly stocked cellar might hold 300 to 500 jars or more, enough to feed a family through winter with vegetables and fruits they'd grown themselves. The canning process required precision. Improper processing could lead to spoilage or, worse, botulism, so families followed tested recipes and processing times religiously. Built root cellars. The root cellar was the refrigerator of its era, a carefully designed underground space that maintained conditions perfect for long-term food storage. They were engineered spaces, dug deep enough to stay cool but not freeze, with proper ventilation to prevent mold and moisture buildup, and dark enough to prevent sprouting. Families built root cellars under houses, barns, or as standalone structures built into hillsides. The ideal root cellar maintained temperatures between 32 and 40 degrees Fahrenheit and humidity around 90%, conditions that kept vegetables in a state of dormancy where they neither froze nor continued to ripen. Shelves were arranged to keep different foods separate, as some produce gave off gases that affected others. Apples, for instance, produced ethylene that could cause potatoes to sprout prematurely, so they were stored in different sections. The cellar's earth walls and floor provided natural insulation and humidity control, while ventilation pipes allowed stale air to escape and fresh air to enter without letting in too much warmth. Packed vegetables in sand or sawdust. This simple technique transformed ordinary wooden crates or barrels into perfect storage containers for root vegetables. The process was methodical. A layer of clean, dry sand or sawdust went into the bottom. Then vegetables were arranged so they didn't touch each other. Then another layer of sand, more vegetables, continuing until the container was full. The sand, or sawdust, served multiple purposes. It maintained ideal humidity around each vegetable, preventing shriveling while not being wet enough to promote rot. It insulated vegetables from temperature fluctuations, and it created physical separation that stopped rot from spreading. Carrots, beets, turnips, and parsnips particularly benefited from this method, staying crisp and fresh for months. The sand needed to be slightly damp, like a squeezed-out sponge, moist enough to prevent vegetables from drying out, but not wet. When vegetables were needed, you'd simply dig into the sand to retrieve what you wanted, then smooth the surface back over the remaining produce. Hung meat in smokehouses. The smokehouse was more than a building. It was a preservation system that could transform fresh meat into shelf-stable food that lasted months. These small structures, usually built separately from the house because of fire risk, were designed with vents at the top to allow smoke to escape slowly and hooks or racks for hanging meat. The smoking process involved both heat and smoke, which worked together to preserve meat through multiple mechanisms. The smoke deposited antimicrobial compounds on the meat's surface, creating a barrier against bacteria. The heat dried the meat, removing moisture that bacteria needed to grow, and the combination of smoke and salt created a hostile environment for spoilage organisms. Families would cure meat with salt first, sometimes for days or weeks, then hang it in the smokehouse where fires of hickory, apple, or other hardwoods burned low and slow, producing steady smoke for days or even weeks. The type of wood mattered. Different woods imparted different flavors. Hickory was most common, giving a strong, traditional smoke flavor. Applewood was milder and slightly sweet. Salted pork and fish salt was the oldest and most reliable preservative, and World War II families used it extensively for pork and fish. Fresh pork would be cut into manageable pieces, rubbed thoroughly with salt, and packed in wooden barrels or crocks with additional salt between layers. The salt drew moisture from the meat through osmosis, creating an environment where bacteria couldn't survive. For pork, families would often use a combination of dry salting and brine curing. The meat would first be packed in dry salt for days, then transferred to a brine solution where it would cure for weeks or months. The resulting salt pork was incredibly salty and needed to be soaked in fresh water before cooking to remove excess salt, but it was shelf-stable for a year or more. Fish received similar treatment, with salt packed around and inside cleaned fish, drawing out moisture and preserving the flesh. The salt used for preservation had to be pure. Additives like iodine could affect flavor and preservation quality, so many families sought out pickling salt or sea salt specifically for this purpose. Fermented cabbage into sauerkraut production was a fall ritual in World War II homes, particularly those with German or Eastern European heritage, though its popularity spread as people recognized its value. Cabbage was shredded, salted, and packed into crocks or barrels, where it fermented over weeks, transforming into tangy, shelf-stable food rich in vitamin C and beneficial bacteria. Salt was mixed with shredded cabbage, usually about 2 to 3 tablespoons per 5 pounds of cabbage. The salt drew water from the cabbage, creating brine. The cabbage was then packed tightly into containers, pressed down to eliminate air pockets, and weighted to keep it submerged under the brine that formed. Over the next few days, natural bacteria on the cabbage began fermenting the sugars, producing lactic acid that preserved the cabbage and gave it that characteristic sour flavor. The containers were covered with cloth to keep out insects and dust while allowing gases to escape. After a few weeks, when fermentation slowed and the taste was right, the sauerkraut would be transferred to jars or simply left in the crocks, stored in cool cellars where it would keep for months. It was also versatile, eaten as a side dish, cooked with meats, or added to soups. Stored apples in straw-lined crates. Apples, when properly stored, could last 4 to 6 months, providing fresh fruit well into winter. But proper storage required attention to detail. Not all apples stored equally well. Families knew which varieties were keepers and which needed to be eaten fresh or processed immediately. Late-season apples like Granny Smith, Northern Spy, and Arkansas Black were preferred for storage. These varieties had firmer flesh and thicker skins that held up better over time. The apples were harvested carefully to avoid bruising, as any damaged fruit would rot and potentially spoil nearby apples. They were then wrapped individually in newspaper or packed in layers separated by clean straw in wooden crates or barrels. The straw served multiple purposes. It cushioned the apples, absorbed excess moisture, and allowed air circulation. The containers were stored in the coolest part of the house, often root cellars or unheated barns, where temperatures stayed just above freezing but didn't drop low enough to freeze the fruit. Through winter, these stored apples provided fresh fruit for eating, cooking, and baking, a luxury when most produce was canned or dried. Dried fruits on screens or in ovens, drying concentrated fruit sugars while removing the water that bacteria needed to grow, creating shelf-stable food that could last for years if properly stored. World War II families dried apples, plums, cherries, peaches, and berries using simple equipment. Window screens elevated on sawhorses or bricks, or low ovens with doors propped open to allow moisture to escape. The process required patience and attention. Fruit was sliced uniformly, usually about 1/4 inch thick, and arranged on screens in single layers. For sun drying, the screens were placed in full sun during the day and brought indoors at night to protect from dew. The fruit needed to be turned periodically for even drying and checked constantly for insects. Oven drying was faster and more reliable, though it required fuel. The oven was set to the lowest possible temperature, usually around 140 to 150 degrees Fahrenheit, and the fruit was left for hours, sometimes overnight, until it was leathery and dry with no moisture pockets. Dried fruit provided concentrated sweetness during winter, eaten as snacks, added to cereals, or reconstituted in water for pies and sauces. Made jerky from beef or venison jerky was portable protein, lightweight, shelf-stable for months, and requiring no preparation beyond chewing. The process started with very lean meat, as fat would go rancid and spoil the jerky. The meat was sliced thin, about 1/4 inch thick, always cutting with the grain to create chewable but not tough strips. These strips were marinated in salt brine, sometimes with spices or smoke flavor if available, then hung to dry. Some families hung jerky in smokehouses, providing antimicrobial protection and smoke flavor. Others used attics or barns, as long as they had good air circulation and protection from insects. The key was steady airflow and low humidity. In dry climates, jerky could be ready in days. In humid regions, it took longer and required more care to prevent mold. The finished product was dark, firm, and dry throughout with no soft spots. Properly made jerky could last 6 months or more, stored in cloth bags or jars in cool, dry places. Rendered and stored lard. When pigs were butchered, every bit of fat was carefully saved and rendered into lard, a cooking fat that would keep for months or even years when properly stored. Rendering was the process of slowly heating fat until it melted and separated from the tissue, producing pure white lard that was versatile and shelf-stable. The process filled the house with the smell of cooking pork fat, not unpleasant, but definitely noticeable. Fat was cut into small pieces and placed in large pots over low heat. As it heated, the fat liquefied while the solid tissues, called cracklings, turned crispy. The liquid fat was strained through cheesecloth into clean containers, often crocks or metal tins, where it solidified as it cooled. The cracklings were saved too, and eaten as snacks or added to cornbread for flavor. Properly rendered lard was pure white or slightly cream-colored with a mild, slightly porky smell. It could be used for all cooking where butter or oil was called for, including baking, where it made exceptionally flaky pie crusts. Pickled everything. If it could be submerged in vinegar, World War II families pickled it. Cucumbers were the most common, transformed into dill pickles, sweet pickles, and bread and butter pickles that filled jar after jar. But pickling extended far beyond cucumbers. Green beans, beets, onions, peppers, eggs, pig's feet, tongue, and even watermelon rind all found their way into vinegar brines. Pickling worked through acidity. Vinegar's low pH created an environment where spoilage bacteria couldn't survive. The process was relatively simple. Vegetables or other foods were packed into jars, covered with a vinegar-based brine often flavored with salt, sugar, and spices, then sealed. Some pickles were processed in boiling water baths for shelf stability, while others were simply refrigerated. World War II families with limited refrigeration tended to process everything for room temperature storage. The vinegar used was typically white vinegar or apple cider vinegar with at least 5% acidity, strong enough to be preserved safely. Pickled foods provided not just preservation, but also flavor variety. Plain vegetables could be monotonous by February, but pickled versions added tang and interest to meals. Bottled milk and cream in cold springs. Families lucky enough to have springs on their property had natural refrigeration year-round. Cold spring water, emerging from underground at constant temperatures around 45 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit, could cool milk and cream better than any icebox. The practice involved placing bottles or crocks of milk directly in the spring water, often building a small stone enclosure to create a pool where containers could sit submerged. The constant flow of cold water maintained temperatures that slowed bacterial growth significantly, keeping milk fresh for several days rather than the few hours it might last at room temperature. Some families built spring houses, small structures over springs where they could store not just milk, but also butter, eggs, and other perishables that benefited from cooling. However, not every family had access to springs, making those who did fortunate in their food preservation options. The spring water method required no ice, no electricity, and no equipment beyond containers, representing the kind of simple, effective preservation that World War II families relied on. Stored potatoes in Cool Pits potatoes were a staple food that needed careful storage to last through winter. Families dug shallow pits, lined them with straw, filled them with potatoes, then covered everything with more straw and several inches of soil. This created an insulated environment that kept potatoes cool without freezing, allowing them to remain dormant rather than sprout or rot. The pit method worked because soil provides excellent insulation against temperature extremes. The depth was crucial. Too shallow and potatoes could freeze. Too deep and digging them out in winter became difficult. Usually pits were about 2 feet deep, with drainage to prevent water from collecting and rotting the crop. Some families created multiple small pits rather than one large one, so they could empty a pit entirely rather than repeatedly opening and closing the same storage, which introduced moisture and temperature fluctuations. The straw layer directly around the potatoes absorbed moisture while providing additional insulation. The soil covering protected against freezing while being removable when potatoes were needed. Made hard cheese and waxed it fresh milk that couldn't be consumed or turned into butter found another use in cheese making. Hard cheeses, properly aged and waxed, could last 6 months to a year without refrigeration, providing protein and fat through winter when dairy cows' production slowed or stopped. The cheese-making process was time-consuming but well-established. Milk was heated, cultures and rennet were added to coagulate it. The curds were cut and heated further to expel whey, then pressed into molds where they'd form solid blocks. These fresh cheeses were then aged in cool, humid conditions, developing flavor and texture over weeks or months. Once properly aged, the cheeses were sealed with wax to protect them from air and moisture. The wax coating was applied by melting cheese wax and brushing or dipping the cheese rounds until they were completely covered in a thick layer. This sealed exterior protected the cheese, allowing it to be stored at room temperature in root cellars or cool pantries. Some families made hard cheeses specifically for winter storage, timing production for fall when milk was still plentiful but before winter reduced supply. Collected ice blocks in winter. In regions with hard winters, ice harvesting provided summer refrigeration. Families would cut large blocks of ice from frozen ponds or rivers, haul them to ice houses, and pack them in sawdust or straw for insulation. Properly stored, this ice could last through summer, providing cooling for perishables. Ice harvesting was backbreaking winter work. Using special saws, Men would cut uniform blocks weighing 50 to 100 pounds each. These blocks were loaded onto sleds or wagons and transported to ice houses, small buildings designed specifically for ice storage. The ice house was usually built partially underground, with thick walls and good drainage to carry away meltwater. Ice blocks were stacked with insulation between layers, often sawdust, which was cheap and readily available from lumber mills and provided excellent insulation. A well-built ice house with sufficient insulation could keep ice frozen well into fall. During World War II, when ice delivery services were disrupted and mechanical refrigeration was expensive or unavailable, stored ice was valuable. Families would chip off pieces as needed for ice boxes or to cool food directly. Made fruit leather and jams fruit that couldn't be eaten fresh, canned, or dried whole was transformed into fruit leather and jams, concentrated forms that preserved flavor and nutrients in small packages. Fruit leather was made by cooking fruit into a thick puree, spreading it thin on oiled sheets, and drying it until it became flexible and leathery. This created a portable sweet snack that kept for months. The process required ripe fruit, often overripe or slightly damaged fruits that weren't suitable for canning. The fruit was cooked down until very thick, sweetened if sugar was available, though natural fruit sugars often sufficed. The puree was spread about 1/4 inch thick on oiled baking sheets or specially made drying screens, then placed in low ovens or sunny spots to dry slowly. The drying took hours to days, depending on the method and humidity. When ready, the leather could be rolled up, often with waxed paper between layers, and stored in jars or tins. Children loved fruit leather, eating it as candy when sweets were scarce due to sugar rationing. Dried beans and peas legumes were protein powerhouses that dried naturally, requiring minimal processing for year-round storage. Families would let bean and pea plants mature completely in the field until the pods dried and rattled with hard seeds. These were harvested, shelled, and stored in jars, bins, or cloth bags where they'd keep for years. The beauty of dried beans and peas was their simplicity. Unlike vegetables requiring complex preservation, beans basically preserve themselves. Once completely dry, with moisture content below 10%, beans were shelf-stable indefinitely. The challenge was protecting them from insects and rodents. Some families stored beans in sealed containers, metal tins, or glass jars with tight lids. Others hung them in cloth bags in cool, dry places where air circulation prevented mold, while the cloth allowed moisture to escape. Bay leaves were sometimes added to storage containers, as their scent deterred weevils and other grain insects. During World War II, when meat was rationed and protein scarce, dried beans became dietary staples. Fermented root vegetables beyond sauerkraut, families fermented turnips, beets, radishes, and other root vegetables in brine, creating tangy, probiotic-rich foods that kept for months. The fermentation process was similar to sauerkraut. Vegetables were cut or shredded, submerged in salt brine, and left to ferment at cool temperatures, where beneficial bacteria transformed sugars into preservative acids. These fermented roots provided crucial vitamins, particularly vitamin C and B vitamins, during the winter months when fresh produce was unavailable. The fermentation process actually increased certain vitamins while making vegetables more digestible. Fermented beets were particularly popular, turning deep purple and developing a complex, earthy sour flavor. Fermented turnips and radishes maintained their crunch while becoming tangy additions to winter meals. The process required clean containers, usually crocks or large jars, and attention to keeping vegetables submerged under brine. Mold could develop if vegetables floated above the liquid, so weights were used to hold everything down. The fermentation would be active for the first few weeks, producing bubbles and sometimes strong odors as bacteria worked. But as fermentation slowed and temperatures dropped, the vegetables would stabilize, ready to be stored in cool cellars for winter use. Stored onions and garlic in braids. The sight of onion and garlic braids hanging from rafters or barn walls was common in World War II homes. After harvest, when the tops had dried, onions and garlic were braided together by their stems, creating ropes that could be hung in any cool, dry place space with good air circulation. The braiding process required skill, but wasn't complicated. Starting with 3 bulbs, their dry tops were twisted together, and additional bulbs were woven in as the braid progressed, creating a strong rope that could hold dozens of onions or heads of garlic. The braiding kept the bulbs separated, allowing air to circulate each one and preventing mold and rot. The hanging position discouraged rodents while making bulbs easily accessible. Just pull one from the braid as needed. Properly cured and braided, onions could last 6 months or more, and garlic even longer. The curing process before braiding was crucial. Onions and garlic needed several weeks in a warm, dry, airy place after harvest to dry their outer skins and seal their necks. Kept grain and flour in metal tins. Grains and flour were vulnerable to moisture, insects, and rodents, making proper storage essential. World War II families used metal tins with tight-fitting lids, storing them in cool, dry pantries or cellars where temperature stayed relatively constant and the humidity was low. The metal containers protected against rodents that could chew through cloth bags or wooden bins. The tight lids prevented moisture and insects from entering, keeping grain and flour dry and fresh. Some families used galvanized garbage cans for bulk storage, smaller tins for daily use. The flour and grain needed to be completely dry before storage, or they'd develop mold or clump together. Families would sometimes add bay leaves or food-grade diatomaceous earth to containers as additional insurance against insects. During World War II, when wheat flour was sometimes rationed and families who raised grain needed to store their harvest, proper storage made the difference between having flour for baking all winter and losing it to spoilage. Whole grain stored better than flour, as the intact grain kernel protected the nutritious interior from oxidation. Families with hand mills could grind grain into flour as needed, ensuring maximum freshness. But most relied on stored flour, using it carefully and checking regularly for signs of weevils or other insects. These 20 methods represent the accumulated wisdom of generations, techniques refined through necessity and passed down because they worked. Which of these methods do you think would be most useful to know today? Let us know in the comments below, and if you found this interesting, leave a hype and subscribe for more.